Thanks. You saved my life.
There are civilians in your sector. You've got to get them out.
Energy.
In your face, mother!
Time to meet your maker. Shield. I'm sure your mother will. Drop your gun. You're under arrest.
Stop or I'll kill him, man!
Guns over! The police department of Neo-Detroit is conducting an investigation into the creation of the game Robocop. Our investigation has led us to the offices of Titus Interactive in Paris, France, where we are about to meet an informer who will supply us with the information we need to bring our investigation to a successful conclusion. Our man inside stated that he can lead us to the people responsible for the creation of the game Robocop. But first, he needs a cup of coffee. Follow me as we find out how the game was created. Suspicious gang activity. This merits further investigation. Let's look at the brainstorming. It was in meetings like this that the project leaders got together to plan the gameplay for what would become Robocop. This is where they decided on the overall game strategy. What kind of traps and tricks to set for me. What kind of weapons I would have at my disposal. And the environment that I would find myself in. This is also where the bad guys and other characters I meet in the game first saw the light of day. We will let these citizens continue with their work and move on to our next suspect, the game designer. We will now meet the principal creators of the game world of Robocop.
His job was defining the game concept. For Robocop, this meant finding the right balance between action and adventure. Once he'd done that, he had to come up with the main events and ideas that allowed them to define the different missions in the game and tie them together into a coherent whole that respected the game scenario. During the creation process, he tried to take into account the ideas of everybody who was working on the project. This wasn't always easy, since there were lots of different people with lots of different ideas, and they sometimes clashed with the original game concept. After the initial phase of creation, he worked with the designers and programmers to create the map of all the various levels in the game. At this phase in development, he had to create detailed definitions and give the precise locations of all the mechanisms used in the game. Creating and designing the environment began with the story, gameplay, and game design. Apart from the graphic design, which was the basis of the visual aspect of the game, the essential part of the designer's job was to give a soul to the game universe, without which it would have been totally lifeless. Working on the volumes and lighting atmospheres was a critical factor in reinforcing the soul of the game universe. This meant creating a rhythmic, dynamic evolution in the game to avoid boring the player, especially in game passages that were more or less inactive. With the appropriate lighting and design style, the player could, consciously or subconsciously, be brought to feel psychological sensations of stress or relaxation, and through these feelings, plunge completely into the game universe. The first thing he did was go through the game design and find out what kind of characters the game needed. For Robocop, this meant he was mainly dealing with bad guys. Whether human or robot, his job was to imagine what the characters might look like, keeping in mind they might belong to one gang or another, that they would all behave differently, and above all, what kind of action they might be performing. Once he'd gotten a good grasp of all of those different factors, he let his imagination run wild. He did hundreds of preliminary sketches until he finally had a handle on everything that he needed to execute the final designs. The design showed the particular details of each character, like, for example, how they moved around or fought. He had to constantly remind himself of the technical restraints of the platform they were designing the game for, so that everything he imagined on paper was technically feasible when it was being built on a computer.
For artistic decisions, our next suspect, the modeler.
When they were building the 3D environment, they had to constantly keep in mind what had happened before and what was going to happen after. Starting with the design and plan of the lead artist and game designer, they first created a volume that they then filled with texture and light. Challenge was to create the most highly detailed environment possible while respecting the technical constraints of the machine. They used the same approach when creating characters and robots, but they also had to take into account the fact that they would be animated later. They had to faithfully follow the initial designs and respect the physical rules for movement, even though they knew that many details would never be placed in volume, but designed directly into the texture. Most often, they worked on half a character and followed up by adding the other half symmetrically. When they modeled a character, it had to be perfect, since it was next to impossible to back up and correct their mistakes once they had added texture and animation. Creating textures began with the designs and 3D models. The design gave them an indication of what colors they had to use and what materials they had to render, like wood, metal, or stone, and the 3D models gave them an idea of scale. To actually create the texture, they began by unfolding the mesh of the 3D models to get reference points. Then they used photos to get the most realistic rendering possible. Once the texture was finished, all they had to do was apply it to the 3D model and make sure that the result corresponded to the original idea.
Once the characters and robots were modeled, it was the animator's job to bring them to life.
Animating the characters for Robocop wasn't very hard. It was a fairly simple matter to set the animation of the control points of the 3D models using Character Studio so that the mesh conformed to the movements of the virtual skeleton. The hardest part was animating some of the robots, particularly the ED-1000. This robot had the same way of walking as its predecessor, the ED-209. The tricky part was weapons deployment, since all the robot's weapons were in an enclosed position in the upper half of its body, protected by two half shells. Once they had correctly adjusted the pivot of movement in the animation keys for each element of the robot, the ED-1000 came to life.
Next suspect, the programmers. These are the people who take all of the bits and pieces we've seen so far and turn them into a coherent whole.
You can look at programming two different ways. Either it's about creating the core of a game, or about putting everything together. For Robocop, both ways were true. The programmer's first job was to code the game engine, along with several tools used by designers. For example, this one was used to modify the behavior of enemies. In order to do that, the programs had to be fluent in computer languages, the most common of which are C and C++. The game engine required up to several thousand lines of code. In the programmer's opinion, the best part of the job was working with 3D models. Once the game engine was finally coded, looking at the game universe or adding special effects like smoke, fire, or water was really rewarding. The programmer had one last job, called integration. They took everybody's work, 3D models, sounds, texture, level designs, and put them right into the console so that they all fit just like a jigsaw puzzle. When that was done, the game finally had a life of its own, and the whole picture appeared for the first time.
The sound designer seems like a suspiciously noisy character. We should question him next.
The sound designer had to create an aural environment, an environment for your ears, that matched the graphic environment, the environment for your eyes. The sound designer worked closely with the game designer, the lead artist, and the graphic artist to come up with sounds for everything in the game. They had to have ambient sounds for atmosphere, like street sounds or the sound of water running. They had to have sounds for things that move, like machines and robots. They had to have sounds for weapons, like explosion, gunshots, lasers, and blasters. In fact, anything that moved in the game had to make a noise. Robocop was an interesting project because many of the voices were recorded in-house at Titus Studios. The sound designer did quite a few voices himself. His job was to make the characters believable. If you had a huge robot
that talks like this,
or a puny, scrawny little character
It talks like this.
you're probably not going to believe in the universe of the game.
We have nearly exhausted our list of suspects. All that's left is to question the quality assurance testers.
testers worked on the game all throughout its development. They started at the very beginning of the project during the brainstorming to enrich the game design based on their own personal experience and a competitive analysis. Then, one of them was named lead tester and followed the project through till its completion. The lead tester made sure that the milestone schedule was respected and distributed work to the other testers. During testing, they pushed the game over its limits to find its weaknesses, and each bug that was found was minutely documented so that the programmers could find it easily and repair it.
Investigation terminated. Conclusion. Excellent game in the first degree. Let the evidence stand for itself. Hi, it's me again, with Matthias, an artist. And this is Robocop. Probably the greatest game ever. It'll blow you away. Oh yeah.